After the collapse of the Third Reich and the end of World War II, the German people found themselves in an unimaginable spiral of suffering. The once proud nation was shattered, with the Red Army's advance from the east marking the start of horrific reprisals. Millions of Germans were subjected to atrocities, including mass executions, sexual violence, and forced expulsions. Entire communities were uprooted as civilians were pushed out of their homes and cities. The suffering didn't end with the fall of Berlin. German soldiers faced a fate as cruel as the war itself. Many were sent to the freezing Siberian labor camps, where hunger, cold, and forced labor became their daily enemies. The few who managed to survive the harsh conditions returned to find their homes destroyed, families missing, and a country that had been torn apart. The emotional and physical scars left by these atrocities would haunt Germany for generations. As Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin in early 1945, Nazi leaders, including Hitler, were increasingly isolated and unable to stop the unfolding disaster. Hitler, retreating to his underground bunker, was cut off from reality. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, continued to feed him false information about non-existent German victories, despite the Soviet artillery being heard in the distance. Meanwhile, civilians struggled to survive in the ravaged cities. Hitler's isolation reached its peak when, on April 30, 1945, he and Eva Braun committed suicide. The following days were filled with further chaos as Goebbels and his wife took their lives and Berlin fell to Soviet forces. The city, once the heart of the Reich, became the symbol of the regime's downfall. The unconditional surrender of Germany on May 7th marked the official end of the war in Europe. But for the German people, the suffering had just begun. The end of the war left German cities, including Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg, completely devastated by relentless bombings. Cities like Berlin became battlegrounds, with Soviet forces fighting fiercely to reclaim the heart of the Reich. The German population, particularly women and children, endured unimaginable suffering, facing food shortages, constant attacks, and the destruction of their homes. The bombings marked a brutal end to the war and left entire cities in ruins. In Berlin, civilians were trapped in the city as Soviet forces closed in. Many had lost their homes and loved ones, and the streets were filled with the sounds of destruction. The final days of the battle saw widespread devastation, and estimates of civilian casualties and sexual violence vary widely, ranging from 20,000 to over 100,000. The situation in other cities like Dresden was no better, as they too were reduced to ashes by constant bombing raids with little hope for survival. As Soviet forces advanced through German territory, revenge for the atrocities committed by the Nazis became a driving force. The Red Army soldiers, fueled by years of suffering and loss, unleashed brutal retaliation. The acts of violence included widespread sexual assault, murders, and looting as they captured cities. Many Soviet soldiers had lost family members to the Nazis, and this fueled their anger and resentment, which played out in horrific acts of vengeance against German civilians. The Soviet soldiers' acts of brutality were, in part, a reaction to the horrors they had endured during the war. Nazi forces had committed extreme atrocities against the Soviet Union, including massacres of civilians and the destruction of entire towns. When the Red Army captured German cities, they made their enemies pay. Cities like Berlin, Dresden, and others saw indescribable violence as the soldiers enacted their revenge, leaving deep scars in both the German civilian population and the collective memory of the war. After the war, the Allies held the Nuremberg trials to prosecute prominent Nazi leaders for their war crimes. The trials, which began on November 20, 1945, aimed to hold 24 individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, including genocide, war crimes, and crimes against peace. These trials marked the beginning of modern international law, exposing the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime and ensuring that the world would not forget the horrors of the war. Although the Nuremberg trials focused on the highest-ranking Nazi officials, many ordinary soldiers and civilians who carried out orders were never held accountable. The trials, while significant, led to debates about the extent of collective responsibility, especially for the German people, many of whom had been living under Nazi rule. While some saw justice, others argued that not all Germans were aware of the full scale of Nazi crimes, highlighting the complexities of justice after a war of such magnitude. After World War II ended, Germany was left in ruins, with its population suffering from extreme hardships. The country was divided into occupation zones controlled by the Allies, and many Germans faced hunger, displacement, and the loss of their homes. Millions were forced to flee from areas that had been annexed or occupied by Nazi forces. Cities were reduced to rubble, and basic resources were scarce, making it difficult for the population to survive in the aftermath of the war. The Allies, especially the Soviets, imposed harsh policies on the German people, demanding reparations and forcing them into labor. The displaced Germans struggled to rebuild their lives, but the destruction of Germany's infrastructure made recovery slow and painful. As millions of refugees from Eastern Europe flooded into the country, the burden on the population grew heavier. By the end of 1945, Germany's rebuilding process had just begun, and its people faced years of suffering before recovery could begin. Millions of German civilians, including prisoners of war, were sent to labor camps in the Soviet Union where they endured brutal conditions. These camps were part of Stalin's plan to use forced labor for reconstruction, especially in key areas like uranium mining for the Soviet nuclear program. Many Germans, unfit for work, suffered from hunger, disease, and extreme mistreatment. Only the weakest were allowed to return home, while others remained trapped in the harsh labor system. By 1949, the Soviet Union had released most German prisoners, but the recovery for these individuals was slow. Many of the repatriated prisoners had been severely weakened by years of forced labor. The conditions they faced in the Soviet camps were unbearable, marked by starvation and harsh treatment. Though some survived, they returned to a Germany still devastated by war, with little hope of immediate recovery and facing the long-term psychological effects of their captivity. The emotional and psychological toll on the German population after the war was immense. Families lost their homes, their loved ones, and their way of life. Many survivors were left to face the haunting memories of bombings, hunger, and violence. Entire communities were displaced, and the social fabric of the country was shattered. The trauma of war left deep scars on the minds of those who lived through it, affecting their generations to come. In some parts of Germany, the despair became so overwhelming that it led to mass suicides. In places like Demmin, Families took their own lives in fear of the approaching Soviet forces. Women, children, and the elderly were among the victims, all desperate to escape the horrors that awaited them. The fear and helplessness were palpable as entire towns fell into despair. The devastation of war left behind a population struggling to survive both physically and emotionally, with little hope for the future.